Hi all, Megan May here, and I'm hoping to talk a little bit today about the declaration from the UN General Assembly on antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. A couple weeks back, during the UNGA, a commission was assembled, and delegates from each country, along with several experts, discussed this emerging, potentially catastrophic situation that we have developing right now, and that is antimicrobial drugs. So that's antibiotics, antivirals, antimalarials, etc., etc. Many of them aren't working so well anymore. And when that happens, what effectively has been a near century of progress in infectious disease, which used to be the very greatest killer of the human population, is suddenly being reversed. So, that being said, the UN General Assembly decided that this was a health crisis of such magnitude that an international coordinated effort was going to be necessary to solve the problem. I agree completely, by the way. So, to give you a sense of how meaningful it is that this action was taken, it's only been taken 3 times previously in the history of the UN General Assembly. And those were to come out with a position and a policy for HIV/AIDS, for Ebola, and for non-communicable diseases, cancer, heart disease, that sort of thing. So, in that context, this is a pretty big deal, right? This declaration is a little bit dry, but I'm going to post the link to it in the very first comment under this video if you would like to look at it. But basically, it comes in 2 phases. The first is stating the problem and acknowledging the factors that went into it developing, and then the second phase is more or less suggesting practical actions for how to address the issue. And first of all, stop it from getting any worse, and second of all, introduce new solutions for how to create new drugs that are going to stop this problem in the future, and then avoid getting back into this same situation again with new medications. Okay, so they basically came up with 3 big reasons for why AMR has become such a crisis. The first one we've all heard a lot about, and that's inappropriate use. In other words, the more you get antibiotics, the more microorganisms are exposed to them, and the more likely they are to become resistant to them. That doesn't mean using antibiotics is irresponsible in any way. What that basically means is that using them when you don't need them is irresponsible. If you have strep throat, you're not to go and say, I'll tough it out because I don't want to contribute to antibiotic resistance as a problem. No, in that situation, you would need an antibiotic, and you taking one and being prescribed one is completely appropriate. What's not appropriate is antibiotic use for things that really aren't bacterial infections. However, that being said, on a global scale, that's kind of the minority of the situations. The major issue that we have in human medicine is that a lot of antimicrobials that in the United States we dispense only by prescription, so we have control over them, are sold over the counter in other countries. So you can walk into a pharmacy and get a bottle of penicillin. And when that's the case, it's almost a guarantee that those antibiotics are going to be used inappropriately, at least some of the time. Okay, so that's problem number 1. A huge issue on top of that is their use in agriculture and veterinary medicine. It's not much of a secret that in large-scale industrial agriculture, antibiotics are routinely added to livestock feed. There are several reasons for this, perhaps a topic for another time, but what ultimately we can conclude from this is that we have massive exposure of microbes to antibiotics through industrial agriculture, and that's something that we need to revisit, but we also need to coordinate very well. And what I mean by that is the antibiotics that some countries reserve as an absolute drug of last resort, we only use this for the most absolutely resistant organisms, are routinely added to agricultural feed in other countries. And so all you need is a microbe from one of those second countries to come into a patient population in the first country, and all of a sudden your drug of last resort is not particularly effective anymore. So misuse is a major issue, and I already hinted more or less at one of the solutions to this. The first is we must very tightly and carefully regulate and control use of antimicrobials, and it has to be done on a global scale. Any efforts made by one country can be unintentionally undermined by a different country that has a different set of regulations. So if an antibiotic is going to be sold over the counter, it cannot be controlled in one country and given freely in another. It should be over the counter in every country, rare circumstances where that's appropriate, or it should be controlled by prescription in all countries. It can't be routine. You can't have a certain antibiotic routinely added to agricultural feed in one country while saved for last resort in another. That doesn't make sense. So on a global level, we all have to get on the same page here. That's point number one. Another point is that we need to incentivize industries and academia and nonprofits to either work together or independently to develop new antimicrobials. If we aren't at the moment flush with options for how to treat these resistant organisms, then we need to think of new strategies and come up with new ways of treating them. Once we do that, we then need to very, very carefully control their use. Okay, so that was aspect number one that the UN General Assembly came up with and addressed. The second aspect is something that we don't talk much about, but it's very important, and that's environmental contamination with antimicrobials. Not something you may have thought about, but it's absolutely true. Organisms in the environment, microorganisms, in the environment are routinely exposed to antimicrobials in trace amounts that are found in the soil, in runoff from industrial plants, in soil that's contaminated with agricultural waste. This is a problem because those organisms, when they get these constant exposures to things that are meant to poison them, if they don't die, they become slowly more and more tolerant to that poison, to the antimicrobial. And when that happens, those organisms, should they find their way into the human population and find themselves capable of causing infection, they're going to be extraordinarily difficult to treat. That's not good. We don't want that. And one thing that you could imagine is that those organisms I just mentioned that may have developed resistance through chronic environmental exposure, those aren't organisms that you would find in a patient who has been overprescribed antibiotics. That person may have been healthy as a horse, received 1 or 2 prescriptions ever in their lives, yet come in contact with a highly drug-resistant organism. So that's something that we really need to be very cautious of. As insinuated, the primary ways that this environmental contamination happens is through industrial waste from plants that process and manufacture antimicrobials, and through agricultural waste, where from industrial agriculture where antimicrobials are added to the feed. Both of these things need to be very tightly regulated, and those regulations need to be policed. If they're not, we're going to continue to have this environmental exposure, and even if we get a really good handle on appropriate usage of antibiotics in human medicine, if these environmental contaminants still exist, that's going to completely undercut any efforts you make towards point number one. So, that's point number 2. Point number 3. This one is really counterintuitive, but I actually think it's the most important one of all. And that is, we need to increase access to health care. That sounds weird, right? Because we're talking about overuse of a medication leading it to not work so well. So why in the world would increased access to healthcare and greater laboratory capacity solve that problem? Again, you have to think on a global scale here. The best way to reduce, if not minimize, the use of antimicrobials is to the extent possible, prevent the need to use them. So what I mean by that is increasing capacity of laboratories to correctly diagnose an infection, increasing availability of vaccines to individuals so that they don't come down with vaccine-preventable diseases and then require antimicrobials to treat them. And it also involves things like helping different countries that may not have the capacity to provide potable water to their populations do so. It involves building that infrastructure so that things like food and waterborne illnesses for which antimicrobials can be prescribed are not being used quite so frequently, or not occurring quite so frequently, and so those medications then aren't being used. It's a critical thing. It's not only the right thing to do from a humane standpoint, it frankly is going to go a long way towards solving this problem, because the more we build that infrastructure for healthcare around the world, the more you're going to reduce the need to use antimicrobials legitimately. So, those are the three aspects. The UN General Assembly did not mince words in their recommendations, particularly on point number 3. They said that the onus is on developed nations to create new drugs. It's on their governments to fund research into creating these new drugs, and it's on developed nations to make these new drugs or new vaccines available to everybody in the world at cost. And that means that you're going to have to do things like produce drugs off patent for persons in the developing world. It means you're going to have to assist developing countries in building their infrastructure for clean water and proper disposal of sewage. Those things have to happen, because if they don't, we're going to persist and continue having this crisis of antimicrobial resistance without addressing those concerns. Any effort we make to do things like not use antibacterial soap, or maybe we don't need to give an antibiotic for that ear infection, those are completely undermined. Those efforts are not enough. All three of these factors need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed globally, because microbes do not respect international borders. And so anything that's done in country A has to be mirrored in country B. And if it's not, it doesn't matter, because all it takes is a few people to travel back and forth across those borders, and country A is going to have the resistance profile of country B, which is going to have the resistance profile of country A. To paraphrase Benjamin Franklin, we must hang together here, because most assuredly we will hang separately. If the world does not work in a coordinated fashion, this problem is not going to go away. And it's a problem that stands to reverse a century of medical progress. I would like to see that not happen. It's going to take a huge coordinated effort. It's going to take an enormous change of thinking from an economic standpoint and from a profitability standpoint. But it's worth it, because we all hang separately. Alright, so that's my quick review of the UN General Assembly's antimicrobial declaration. If you would like to read it, again, it'll be linked in the first comment on YouTube. And read through it, think about it. It's not something that in developed countries we might want to hear, but it's true. This is the way forward. This is the strategy we need to employ. And we have to get used to that idea. That's all there is to it. Otherwise, we all hang separately. All right, see you next time.